Today we look at goal number 3 that all countries have when it comes to the economy: limit inflation. Now on the screen you can see a small child. This picture was taken in the country of Zimbabwe in 2008. And you notice in his hand that he's got stacks of $200,000 bills, currency and valued at $200,000, or equivalent in Zimbabwe's currency. Part of the reason why he's walking around the streets with that much money is simply because the extremely high level of inflation that Zimbabwe experienced in 2008. Now you can also see a picture down at the bottom of a $100 trillion bill. Yes, with a T, $100 trillion. And that was real currency. And part of the reason why is because prices were rising so quickly that eventually they'd have to start to print higher and higher and higher denominations of currency to try to keep up with in some way, shape, or form with the skyrocketing inflation. To give you an idea of how bad it actually was, at the peak of this hyperinflation period that Zimbabwe experienced, it took 24 hours for prices to double. So again, think about that. If you paid for something on Monday, that was $10. Tuesday, it would cost you $20. Wednesday, it would cost you $40. Thursday, it would cost you $80. On Friday, it would cost you $160. And so just imagine every 24 hours the price is doubling. That could be the potential trouble with inflation. So let's talk a little bit more about what inflation is. Again, we've talked about it before. It's this general rising of prices. And again, we're talking about prices for all products, or at least most products. And the big thing that we see is that it simply reduces the purchasing power, what you're able to buy with the money you have. Now we have to be careful in that it doesn't change the value of the money. It simply decreases the purchasing power that you have with that money. So to give you an example, it takes about $2 to buy what would have cost $1 in 1982. Again, these are just kind of some general numbers for you. If you were to go back to 1961, it would now take $6 to purchase what $1 would have bought in 1961. So what we see with inflation is that when inflation occurs, each dollar of income buys fewer goods than before. Now, we've talked about economic growth. So as long as economic growth outpaces inflation, so we're producing more at a faster rate than inflation is going up, then inflation's not a huge problem. Problem is, though, if it's only inflation happening, then that decrease of purchasing power can become very problematic. So let's talk about how we measure inflation. Now again, like with any of these economic measures that we've talked about, unemployment, GDP, we do have some questionable things, or things we have to consider, at least with inflation, that may hurt the accuracy. But the way that the government tracks inflation is they look at the prices of a collection of goods and services from year to year. We call this the market basket. The market basket in the United States is made up of about 300 commonly purchased goods. And so what they do is they literally will track the price of these goods over long periods of time. They try to select products that will be purchased from year to year. They will make changes to the market basket from time to time when necessary, especially with technological changes, but they try to keep comparable products in the market basket so that it's an accurate measurement. The inflation rate is simply a percentage change in the prices in a 1-year period. And again, what we're going to look for to measure inflation, because again, we want to see if it's just prices going up, is to compare it to a base year. Again, 1982 is one of the more common base years that you'll see used, but they will tell you which base year they want you to consider. When we talk about inflation and using it to compare years, we will often use inflation as a percentage, saying inflation has gone up 3% relative to that base year. One thing to look for whenever you're given an inflation percentage is it simply a year-to-year change, or is it a change from the base year? You'll always be able to find that information, but that's helpful to look for. So just to give you a few examples of how we might use this. For instance, in 2005, the inflation rate was 3.4%. If we were to talk about 1982 as a base year, U.S. prices have increased 98.3% since our base year, meaning prices have almost doubled. When you get to 100%, that means prices have doubled. Bolivia, for instance, in 1985 experienced an inflation rate of around 50,000%. Again, extremely high. We call this a period of hyperinflation. We gave you the example with Zimbabwe of prices doubling every 24 hours. In Bolivia in 1985, you would have bought a $25 meal. That same meal would have then cost you over $12,000 a year later. Just to put it into perspective, how a long period of hyperinflation, what types of problems it can cause. Here you can see just a kind of an overview of inflation across the world. Again, the oranges and reds signify higher rates of inflation. Here you can see inflation in the United States from 1914 to present up to about 2009 is the end date for this particular graph. We'll talk about the difference between inflation, which is the general rising of prices, and deflation, which is the general lowering of prices. Kind of contrary to what might make sense, deflation is actually worse than inflation, and we'll get into that discussion in class on why that is. So the question is inflation good or bad? And like we see with a lot of economics, the answer is it depends. Inflation depends completely on which side of the equation you fall on, if it's going to be beneficial or if it's going to hurt you. So let's look to see who will be hurt by inflation and who would be helped by inflation. So first let's look at who's hurt by inflation. So the first group of people that will always be hurt by inflation, by prices going up, are people who loan money, lenders. People who loan money out. They loan money out with the idea that they will be repaid that amount plus some interest at a later date. Well, what happens is, especially if there's a fixed interest rate, meaning they lock in what that interest rate they're going to charge is, people who loan money out and then inflation occurs, when people go to pay that money back, the purchasing power has changed. And so therefore, it becomes easier for people to pay these loans back. The money the lender receives actually has less purchasing power than when they originally loaned that money. Another group of people that are hurt by inflation are people that lived on fixed incomes. Again, it all goes back to purchasing power. So even though the value of the money that they have remains constant, they're getting that fixed income in every month, the purchasing power of the amount that they receive in that fixed income continues to decrease. And so therefore, the longer that inflationary period goes, the worse off people on fixed incomes will be. The other one are people who save money, savers. If you leave all of your money in just a savings account, over time, inflation will slowly chip away at the purchasing power of that money. So as it sits in that account, it's not being used. If inflation continues to occur, then the purchasing power of that money, if it's just left in the account, will slowly dwindle away to erase any purchasing power that you had. But for all of those who are hurt by inflation, there are also some who are helped by inflation. If we said lenders are hurt by inflation, then that means the people who took out the loans, the debtors, the people who borrow money, are going to be helped. It's going to be easier for them to pay these loans back because the purchasing power that they received when they borrowed the money, right? So let's say they take out a loan in 2010, they're going to buy something with that money. When they pay that money back in 2014, the purchasing power of the money that they pay back is going to be a lot lower than the purchasing power of the money when they borrowed it in 2010. And so they're going to be benefited by inflation or helped by inflation. The other category that they might throw at you sometimes in test questions are businesses where the price of the product increases faster than the price of resources. And the reason why they would be helped by inflation is because the profit margins would increase. And so they could sell the product for more, still purchase the resources at a lower cost, or at least the price of those resources is not growing as fast as the price of the finished product, and therefore they would be making a profit because of inflation. The other thing that we should point out when we talk about inflation is a lot of companies will try to account for inflation, particularly to cover people's salaries or incomes. And so you often will see or hear about COLA, or cost of living adjustments. All these COLA adjustments are negotiated wage increases. So if you see a salary scale that has different steps, every year you go up by a small percentage. While it looks like a raise, really the goal of that is simply to allow your salary to keep up with inflation, so that your purchasing power from year to year remains relatively constant. And so there's just a quick overview of who would be helped and hurt by inflation. In class, we will do some practice with the actual formula we use for inflation, the Consumer Price Index. We'll talk about that market basket, and then we will start to draw a close to this unit and start to piece all three of these economic goals together to see how they interact with one another. Until next time.